This is Lecture 8 in the Introduction to Tourism module 223, and I'm going to be taking you through the slides and speaking to the PowerPoint as I would if I was there giving the lecture. Lecture 7 was on the tourist gaze, and today what we're going to be doing is taking this further and looking in more detail at the nature of the tourist experience. We're going to be bearing in mind the insights from last week's lecture about the tourist gaze. So if you missed that lecture, you should really watch that lecture first. Of course, I don't have a voiceover for that because I was physically giving that lecture, but the PowerPoint is available. And it's important that you understand the concept of the tourist gaze. So a question we raised in class last week was when we said, isn't it a bit monolithic, that this tourist gaze is all-encompassing and it sort of presents tourists as passive recipients. Now, can that be right? Do they just swallow everything, or are they able to speak back? These texts, which are produced, by the tourism industry, that point out the sites that tourists are supposed to see. These texts that construct this gaze surely go through a process of interpretation and reinterpretation by the tourist after they've had the experience. And I find the tourist gaze a very fascinating concept, theoretically very important, but I think speaking back is also important. So the agency of the tourist, their own ability to think and critique, their own agency has got to be there somewhere. And this is what we're going to have a look at today. Are tourists only manipulated or almost seduced by the images that they are shown? And a number of scholars have argued that we should see them as rather as active participants in the creation of ideology and myth. Look, really what the tourist industry is selling is ideology and myth. It's not reality. But in consuming that, let's try and see the tourists as active participants in that, and even able to speak back. So of course there is this very real element of manipulation, and where the tourist industry creates the images and representations which are then consumed. But can we make the tourist more active in our understanding? And a way to do that is to actually look at the tourist experience. Okay. Right, so I've got a reading by a man called Andrew Norton, which is very helpful. And what Norton has done is he's used another kind of model called the circuit of culture model to try and get a more nuanced understanding of the tourist experience. The circuit of culture model is used in media studies and so on, where they actually study the impact or the way in which the viewer interprets what they're getting from the media. Okay, so if you take that and you apply it to tourism, tourism has this whole element of experience, which is over and above simply consuming a movie or something like that. So can one adapt that kind of model to tourism? And this is what Norton does. And in doing so, he's focusing on the active participation of the tourist, his or her interaction with the media, advertising representation, or whatever they're consuming, and that's building that image for them. Okay, so let's have a look at the circuit of culture model. Didn't come out all that well with my cell phone camera taking a photograph, of it from Norton's reading, but the reading is on a Canva, and I've also written there the words that are obscured. Okay, so what I like about this is that it's a circuit, which means it's circular and it's a process, and it feeds back into itself. So, for example, if we start with the production of the image or the text, which is trying to shape the tourist gaze, so we start on the left with the tour operators producing these texts. The text would be tourist brochures, but nowadays, of course, very influential websites and advertising online, the World Wide Web pages. Okay, images that are presented there. And then texts which are represented here as readings. So when you're planning a holiday, you go through this phase. So the darkened blocks, the ones that didn't come out well, are the tourist experience. Anticipation. You then consume that and have the actual experience at the tourist place, and then from there you have a process of reflection that feeds back when you go home into your home culture, and you can then hopefully influence the production of the images, and so it goes around. Now in the four corners you can see the key elements here. So the experiential is never purely an experience on its own that the tourist can have. The tourist can't, it's very difficult if you're on a package deal. It's always going to be mediated, which is at the top there, mediated by the industry. And it's those public representations, top left, that are happening. But then at the bottom is the private lives. So the private lives and the experiential that's the realm of the tourist experience, the actual individual tourist. And they're consuming the public representations which are mediated by the industry. Okay, so we'll go into more detail now on this framework and then go back to it again at the end and see how applicable it is. So in thinking about the tourist experience, what's being argued here is that there are three distinct phases of engagement. It's not just being on the holiday. The first stage is the stage of anticipation. They call it daydreaming, but it's not simply daydreaming as in wild fantasies of impossible events. It is what they call planful dreaming, planful fantasies, which involve the anticipation of probable future events that can really happen. So it's a form of daydreaming that's directed. It's got a plan. It's planful. The package tour operators, of course, would come in here because they're offering these dreams for the potential tourist to consume, the daydream. So in a way, what you're buying is a dream. And I just want to show you an example of this just now. So this period of anticipation is also known as the initial reading. When you make the initial reading of the situation and you then make the booking. After the booking, there's a further period of anticipatory dreaming. You've booked your trip and now you're getting even more excited about how it's going to be. So the important point is all this is a crucial part of the tourist experience, even though this person has not yet got to the destination. So the actual event is prefigured or preceded or, prefigured by a planning phase. All right, so here's my example. This is an island off the East African coast near Zanzibar. And so this is the images that you're consuming. You're consuming images and text from, well, nowadays it's mainly online, isn't it? Okay, what is the dream here? It's of a remote, pristine island, your own island, going on a luxury holiday on your own island. That's very much a dream. It's a daydream, but could it become reality? Well, this tour operator is offering for this to become reality. So this is how they promote it. If you have ever harbored the secret wish of finding yourself the sole inhabitant of a beautiful tropical island, that's the dream, but without the effort of having to lift a finger to fend for yourself, and beyond Mbemba Island, so that's the name of the package, and beyond Mbemba Island is just the place for you. Discover sheer unpretentious paradise, consuming paradise, on this private island. So you won't be crowded, you'll have your island to yourself, where the simple pleasures become your most treasured of memories for many years to come. Selling memories. Relax and unwind in the exclusivity of your own stretch of beachfront, where simple yet luxurious bandas, which are the rooms you stay in, peep out onto unblemished sands from the dappled shade of the Casuarina pine forest. Can you see that that is selling you a dream or a fantasy and promising that this can become real? So when you read that, your mouth is just watering, anticipating this wonderful stay on your own tropical island. That's the type of room that you'll be staying in. This is the banda, I suppose, yeah? Must be an East African word for, a hut. But I mean, this is a luxury. This is a luxury hut. Okay, so that's the first phase, which is the pre-phase, the anticipation, the planning, the prefiguring phase. Now, where does that phase happen, that prefiguring phase? And since I can't see you, I can't ask for the class to tell me, but of course that happens in your own space at home. This is why we say that tourism, we must see it as integrated with everyday reality as well. So we're consuming those dreams while we are at home. Then, of course, there's the experience of the holiday itself. And Norton and the others would argue that this allows for a reinterpretation that's based on experience. So the tourist gaze lecture showed us that the tourist is looking out for signs to validate and authenticate their experience of the tourist destination. So a tourist coming to Cape Town will be expecting that sign of Table Mountain, and I'm sure they'd want to go up Table Mountain in the cable car and consume the mountain, maybe walk up the mountain. The mountain, very important. This would then validate and authenticate their contact with the destination, the place, Cape Town. Okay, so that's what tourists are looking for, signs to validate. And that we were saying with the tourist gaze, that can become like just a closed circle. But Williams points out that experience can change that, and there's quite an interesting point to be made in that experience happens not only through the visual but also through the body. We began speaking about that last week in the lecture, that we do have other senses. Yes, the visual or the eyes lead, but after that we also have other senses, the rest of our body, and smell and so on. But engaging the whole body in doing an activity. So there are new forms of tourism where the experience is about the body, and it's to do with adventure tourism, some of them. So these are very much embodied forms of experience. It's not just lying on the beach. You actually are tasting, feeling, getting the adrenaline rush, everything in your destination. So something like this. Okay, which is whitewater rafting on the Zambezi River near the Victoria Falls. Okay, you're not going to go over the falls itself because then you'd probably be dead. But it's definitely dangerous and exhilarating, and it's creating an embodied experience that you're never going to forget. There are going to be memories that are going to last a lifetime because of this embodied experience that you've had as an adventure tourist. I can think about others, like rock climbing, different types of adventure tourism. Another kind of embodied tourism is where you get to have a personal one-on-one interaction with an animal. So the photo I had at the beginning about the elephants, the elephant rides, that's a very embodied experience. You can see the tourists on the top left are having a physical bodily interaction with an elephant, where the elephant is picking up water in his trunk or her trunk and spraying, the tourists, and they're getting physically wet with the spray from the elephant's trunk. You're never going to forget that. Riding on elephant back safaris have become quite popular in recent years, quite controversial. There are people that argue that this is not right, that the elephants in being trained are being subdued and possibly not treated well, but then you get other people saying that elephants are we know they're incredibly intelligent animals, and so they welcome people, they know who to trust and so on. Anyway, it's an experience you're never going to forget. Look how high up you are, on the back of that elephant. So embodied experiences. Okay, then you've got the third phase, broad phase, which is after the trip, which is reflection. So this is a period where, the experience, the actual holiday is finished, but the experience is not finished, because on the return home, you're going to refer to the accumulated memories of the trip, particularly captured visually through, they say holiday snaps, but all the photographs you've taken, the videos and so on. And then also a lot of people buy mementos or actual souvenirs, which are physical objects, so that when you see that physical object in your house, for example, becomes integrated in your home, but then even though you're in your everyday environment, you see that and then you remember or kind of relive that part of the trip where you purchased that item or whatever. So on the return home, there's a period of reflection on the holiday experience. Okay, and then to put it in fancy academic language, this reflection will modify the understandings of the holiday experience. Okay, we can get that. Which will then become discursively circulated back into the lived culture of the home society. So your understanding of the trip, as you discuss it with your friends, it will enter into the conversation about what that destination is like, and it will deepen the understanding of other people from your home country about that destination. So the next slide should be that model again. Oh, it's coming up just now. How is this done? It's done through photographs, films. In the old days, one would take slides and then have a slideshow. We have had some slideshows in the department. Whenever Dr. Bookstein goes on a trip, which he often does, he always has a slideshow afterwards, showing us where he's gone. Of course, conversations with friends and family and the souvenirs I mentioned. So this is a period of recall where the trip is relived. And probably you're going to do this repeatedly because you're going to have to tell the story to your friends, you're going to have to narrate the story to your work colleagues. Even if it's not a formal slideshow, you're going to be showing them photographs. You might sit on your own and go through your photographs. And basically over time what happens is you create a narrative. The tourist, I'm saying, the tourist creates a narrative of that, of the whole experience. And the narrative almost becomes the holiday. I always find that interesting how that happens, that particular elements, events or experiences will be forgotten while others will be highlighted. And over time, you find that the highlights are what tend to remain. So whether it's something very funny that happened, something very amazing that you saw, amazing that you did, or maybe something that went wrong, like your suitcase, got lost and you never arrived at your destination, and the whole trip you were, having to wear the same clothes or something like that. That will become part of the narrative of that holiday. Or maybe you were with a partner and, you had a big fight during the holiday. So the tourist experience, do you see what I mean? It's going to color what happened, and you're going to think about it afterwards. What happened is going to be colored and reinterpreted. And then, of course, after a short time, you start thinking, I want to go on another holiday. And so you're going to use all the information you've gained from this, and you're going to start that whole process again of anticipatory planning for another trip. Right, so here's the circuit of culture framework again. And so you can see that it's a circular thing. And now you understand better those three things that I've written in there, the three stages. The stages of anticipation, the experience, and then the reflection afterwards. So you look at the texts, you do various, you read, you then choose, well, you anticipate, then you choose and you buy your package. That's the consumption part. So you've bought it, okay, and then, of course, your experience of it is what you've bought. Remember we said tourism is an industry, but it's not like a normal industry, because what you're buying is intangible things like experience. Can you see that more now? You're consuming the tourist place, you're consuming place, and then when you get back, you've got this period of reflection, conversations where you feed that back into the discourses about that place and your home culture. then it goes around again to the tour operators that are producing the texts, and so on and so on. So, for example, if you were to get that, diagram in a test or an exam, you would be able to explain it to me. Why is this a very nice understanding? I said it's very nice because it's circular, and so it progresses and it changes, and different things feed in different places. But also, okay, so why is it good? Well, first of all, this type of understanding of the tourist experience emphasizes the holistic nature of experience, and the fact that the total experience of tourism is much more than just the visit itself. The total experience of tourism is much more than just the visit itself. There's an integration between the home environment and the visited environment. So those mobilities become part of it. And it shows how important aspects of the tourist experience occur in the home environment. It's just as integral. It's not just the trip, the pre-planning, the anticipation, the planful nature of this is part of the whole thing. And in this way, tourism becomes enmeshed in aspects of daily life, rather than being confined to the trip itself. I think that this lens is quite useful because tourism becomes then not separate from daily life, but enmeshed or part of it, both before the trip and then after the trip during the period of reflection. These are quotes from our friend Stephen Williams. We looked at part of his chapter 1 before. This is another part of chapter 1. So do have a read of the entire chapter 1. It's got, earlier we looked at the definitions of tourism from that chapter, and now we're looking at this section on tourist experiences, and also typologies. So it's on eCanva. What's also nice about this, especially for the geography students, we're thinking about tourism experience. It's strongly grounded in geography because it's about the place where the experience is located. Okay, and some models don't just have those 3 stages. Those are the 3 main stages, but some models stress the inclusion of the outward journey itself and make it very specific that the outward journey to the destination is also part of the experience. Because when you're going on your outward journey, you're full of anticipation, you're very excited, you're traveling, etc. So the outward journey becomes a part of it. And then, of course, the return journey, which is not as exciting. You might be a bit exhausted. And, of course, you're thinking now about having to go back to work and so on. So it's a very different experience, the outward journey and the return journey. Might be the same aeroplane and the same flight, but your feelings and your experience is very different. Of course, some people might feel, okay, I've had my holiday and I just want to get back home and see, my family or my pets or whatever it is. It might not be negative. So the experience of the tourist includes those journeys and those mobilities. So these places, environments, and mobilities are all essential. It's interesting that as I'm speaking, there's an aeroplane flying overhead. I don't know if you could hear that. These places, environments, and mobilities are all essential in thinking about the tourist experience. that was a very good timing, that aeroplane. Okay, and then let's go on a bit more with Norton. You know, he's the guy that came up with the circuit of culture and applied it to tourism, the model. He argues explicitly that tourists can actually speak back to the representations created by the industry. He did research on the experience of international tourists visiting East Africa. So he looked at the texts and the images that were produced, that they consumed prior to the trip, and then also interviewed tourists after the trip when they were reflecting on their trip. He argues that tourists do have discriminating abilities. By comparing the representations in the tourist brochures with their already constituted cultural knowledges, okay, so even before they go, they have some sense of what Africa is like. It's not total naivety, hopefully. And then with the knowledge they acquire on the trip and what they see, the tourists are able to reinterpret the texts of tourist promotion and the tourist sites. So yes, I still like the idea of the tourist gaze, but we have to allow some flexibility within that tourists can see other things that are not supposed to or that are not marked for them as what they should be looking at. I really think that's important, because otherwise we're just viewing tourists as gullible idiots, like in that poem from the beginning of the course. Remember the poem where tourists were, you know, pushing their noses against the windows to try to look into empty churches and so on. Do you remember that? So, you know, we after all are tourists at some time in our lives. And we know that it's a more complex experience. Okay, so this photo I found, it's actually part of a video, but it's showing, so say for example in the tourist brochure, can't go back. In the tourist brochure, it's saying you're going to be seeing these wonderful views of African animals and spectacular wildlife. You're going to be seeing this beautiful lion. You're not expecting a whole lot of other cars, other people, other viewers, and you're probably not expecting to get this close up to a lion. Well, this would be exceptional. But what I'm really showing you here, I suppose, is the fact that the wildlife are being irritated, you know, by the constant viewing. There are too many cars, there's a game viewing vehicle, they're private vehicles. And so what they're actually getting is very different than what the brochure has promised them. So the people that Norton interviewed commented on the crowded experience of game viewing in the game parks in East Africa. That's one thing that they were not expecting. And in detail, I won't go into detail on his findings. You can have a look at the article. But basically, they were saying East Africa is much more complex. They could see that it was much more complex than the simple images of primordial nature, you know, wild animals, and quote-unquote noble savages that they had consumed prior to the visit from brochures. So in advertising East Africa, often there's a specific tribe that is highlighted because they are very statuesque, very colorful clothing, traditional clothing, and so on. They're called the Maasai. They are very important in tourist marketing of East Africa. So they are kind of the epitome of the noble savage. I mean, we can have the similar example in South Africa of the way that the Zulu is marketed as the noble savage in the South African context, right? So it's a very simplistic, almost, well, it really needs decolonizing, that image of the noble savage, isn't it? If we talk about the decolonization debates. Anyway, they could see that East Africa was much more complex than these simple images of wild nature and noble savages. A lot of them mentioned that they were upset and struck by the poverty, upset by it. Of course, that's absent from the brochures. So the representations that they had before, well, from the brochures of East Africa as one big game park, and I think TV and media, nature documentaries, wildlife documentaries, also contributes to that in terms of what international visitors expect when they come to an African destination. So they also mentioned being upset by the poverty and feeling uncomfortable because they hadn't expected to feel so wealthy in that context, like they're just normal people from England or something, and suddenly in an East African context they are wealthy, they are the haves, and everyone, there are many have-nots, and people are desperate for them to buy their souvenirs or buy their carvings or buy their whatever, and so you get this north-south, which we spoke about earlier, relationships in tourism, and it can be actually very upsetting for the visitors who are not perhaps expecting it. So a lot of the brochures and what they're supposed to be looking at, they did look at that, but they also saw other things that they maybe weren't supposed to see or weren't being directed to by the tourism marketers. So their whole understanding of the place was challenged by the experience of being there. And then the next stage, go home, reflect, and so on. And so it's circular. But Norton's big point is that tourists are active agents in this, and they are able to distinguish, and they are able to think critically about the simplistic images that get presented for them to gaze at. At the same time, those images and that media is incredibly powerful, next week's tutorial, you're going to be looking at a reading about tourism to Uganda. Okay, and we're talking about that pre-phase, the anticipatory phase. They're just looking at websites, and they're bringing in their cultural knowledge of Africa, which in their minds, it's a risky destination. Words like Ebola maybe come into war and so on, come into their mind. And so what the website is trying to do is to counter those negative images and attract the tourists with more positive, but still stereotyped images. And the article is all about how possible it is to influence tourists' images of a destination. Yeah, but that's before, obviously, the experience of being there. So this lecture is all about, has been all about the experience, looking at the experience of the tourist and looking at it in a multi-layered way, and a more complex way. Those are the references for the lecture. I mentioned Williams. That whole chapter 1 is very important for this course. You've read part of it already on the definitions. Okay. It's called Tourism, Geography, and Geographies of Tourism. And then the other reference is Andrew Norton's article about safari tourism in East Africa. He's looking at the reproduction of environmental discourse through safari tourism in East Africa. And what is so good about that article is the circular model, the circuit of culture, and the way that he's adapted that to understanding tourism experience, or the tourist experience. And that's the end of this lecture. Thanks very much.